Today's sermon is titled Finding the Daniel People for Our Time. Finding the Daniel People for Our Time. As the United States and the rest of the world struggle to contain and overcome the coronavirus pandemic, the handwriting on the wall figure of speech has stayed in my mind. People who are not well versed in the Bible may not know that this figure of speech is taken from a legendary event recounted in the 5th chapter of Daniel. The passage recounts how a Babylonian ruler named Belshazzar staged a banquet for thousands of his lords to celebrate Babylonian power. While under the influence of wine, Belshazzar ordered that sacred vessels plundered from the Jerusalem temple during the conquest of Judah be used as wine goblets. Think about that. Sacred vessels that had been taken from a temple were to be taken out of storage and used as wine goblets. The New Revised Standard Version renders the passage in the following words. So they brought in the vessels of gold and silver that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king was watching as it wrote. Then the king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. The sight of a disembodied hand writing on a plastered wall during a state banquet immediately transformed the mood from festive to grim. That would mess up any party. The mood worsened when none of the king's wise men could read the writing or interpret its meaning. Think of this. This powerful ruler having this great feast with all of his chief wizards and wise men, all of a sudden is unable to get an answer to this question. A public disruption of a public banquet and a public embarrassment when all of the leading folks are puzzled. But the queen mother, the king's mother, who happens in Daniel to be the only woman who speaks in the entire book, identified Daniel, one of the leaders among the exiled Jews, as someone capable of reading and interpreting the bizarre inscription. So the king summoned Daniel to the banquet hall and offered him a reward and a promotion if he could decipher and interpret the inscription. And Daniel rejected the offer. He rejected the royal offer and then recounted Babylon's history of conquest over other nations. And then, in the middle of the banquet, Daniel boldly accused the king of sacrilegious debauchery by using religious vessels as instruments for his narcissistic celebration of the Babylonian Empire. And then Daniel deciphered the Aramaic handwriting inscribed on the wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. He announced to the Babylonian ruler that, quote, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided. Close quote. That is the origin of the term handwriting on the wall. That phrase is moral wordplay about an imminent danger or threat that someone cannot recognize and from which there is no escape. And so we ask, handwriting on the wall. Is the coronavirus pandemic a handwriting on the wall moment? Is this a handwriting on the wall experience? The United States has long craved the status of empire. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union competed for world dominance until the Soviet Union collapsed. And from that point onward, every U.S. president and politicians from every political persuasion have boasted about American exceptionalism. At the conclusion of his farewell address to the nation on January 11, 1989, President Ronald Reagan fondly spoke of the United States as a, quote, shining city on a hill, close quote, a phrase borrowed from one of the pilgrims named John Winthrop. Across many generations, the U.S. has considered itself the indispensable ally to world security and prosperity and freedom. And like the Babylonian ruler in Daniel chapter 5, our nation has long employed sacred objects and references as props for imperial aspirations, power, and chauvinism. Do we dare say narcissism? Think of how politicians from every persuasion routinely end their speeches by saying, God bless America. President Trump is merely the latest national leader to invite us to engage in the blasphemous act of invoking God to represent and to promote and to defend attitudes and policies and practices that advance greed and bigotry and violence. We celebrate being the biggest, and then we say USA, USA, USA. Whether we're looking down our noses at other countries, or whether we're abusing people who are immigrants from other lands, or whether we're just running over our native brothers and sisters, we crave the power and the prestige of empire. And in the same way that the disembodied hand disrupted and disturbed and discomforted the festive mood of the Babylonian banquet at Daniel chapter 5, the coronavirus infection has disrupted and disturbed and discomforted us now. The world has long known that infectious diseases happen, but the United States now resembles, like that Babylonian ruler, Belshazzar and his banquet guests, startled, helpless people, just as they were when they saw that hand write an undecipherable message on a plastered wall. All of our wise people are not able to figure out how to decode the coronavirus. Try as he might, President Trump cannot muster and cannot bluster the coronavirus away. His team of advisors cannot spin a way out of it. And it is not just Mr. Trump and his advisors that have been measured and weighed lacking in this moment. Our whole idolatry of greed and nationalism has been laid bare. All of our usual gods have been empty. Oh, we can't turn to the sports god because Sports Center isn't on. ESPN God isn't working because ESPN isn't on. We can't turn to the food god because the restaurants are closed. We can't turn to the play god because the gyms and the golf courses and the tennis courses are going. We can't turn to the distraction God. All of our gods have been found helpless. And so the obsession about the impact of the coronavirus on the stock market is our biggest God. We want the economy, the economy, the economy, the economy God. And all of a sudden, the economy God is not helping us. Relying on racism isn't helping us. You'll notice how Mr. Trump insisted on calling the coronavirus a Chinese virus, as if that was going to make the virus go away. That just simply exposed Mr. Trump's racism and his cultural incompetence. But it didn't do anything, a thing, to make the coronavirus go away. The self-professed evangelical conservative pastors and congregations and politicians who disregarded warnings and pleas from scientists and physicians about the need to practice social distancing and avoid large gatherings have shown that the white nationalist religious God, what I call hateful faith, isn't working this time. Hateful faith is making people physically sick the same way that it sickened the moral and social health in the United States and across the world. And Mr. Trump's haste to declare himself a wartime president hasn't done anything. Having the most nukes doesn't fix the coronavirus. You can't jet bomb this away. Have you noticed that Mr. Trump's religious advisors, like the Babylonian wizards in Daniel chapter 5, seem to have little by way of comfort or counsel or clarity to help us out of the situation? The God of prosperity gospel isn't working. And so we have to see that the handwriting is on our wall. As in Daniel chapter 5, our gods have been weighed in the balance and found lacking. Our theology, the U.S. theology of racism, the theology of white religious nationalism, the theology of white supremacy, the theology of militarism, the theology of capitalism has been weighed in the balance and found lacking. I don't know whether the COVID-19 is a plague from God, and I don't really think it's useful for us to argue about whether it is or isn't. What is beyond debate is that this global pandemic, like the handwriting on the wall in Daniel chapter 5, has interrupted our banquet. Our banquet has been interrupted. It has interrupted our long-running idolatrous banquet of materialism and racism and white religious nationalism and militarism. The banquet, the same banquet that Martin Luther King Jr. prophetically identified as lethal threats to the nation a year to the day before he was murdered in his speech at Riverside Church on April 4, 1967. The banquet has been interrupted by a source that, like the handwriting on the wall in Daniel chapter 5, was not invited and cannot be ignored. Notice in that lesson in Daniel, nobody invited the hand. Nobody could make the hand go away. Nobody could make the hand stop writing. The coronavirus was not invited. The coronavirus was not on the agenda. Nobody planned to make the coronavirus the star of the show, but nobody can ignore it. The coronavirus is the handwriting on our wall. And what this handwriting is showing us is all of the underbelly of our gods, of our false God. The false god of racism is being shown up because the most obvious sign of the coronavirus impact is how it is disproportionately impacting communities of color. The idol god of greed and capitalism is showing up because poor people, unwealthy people are affected. The coronavirus of our addiction to a capitalistic healthcare system is showing up. All of a sudden, we're realizing coronavirus doesn't care whether you have health insurance or not. If you can't work, coronavirus sends you home. We all of a sudden are spending trillions of dollars to prop up a healthcare system that doesn't cover everybody, and we have yet to ask ourselves, why in the name of God haven't we decided that it is right for us to have free access to health care if we're going to give money to pay for health care in an emergency? Well, the handwriting on the wall brought that out, not because we invited it, but because we can't stop it. I wonder, though, who will be the people like Daniel in our situation? Who will be the people like Daniel? Certainly not the folks in Wall Street. They don't have answers to this. Certainly not the military. You can't bomb this away. Could I say certainly not Fox News and talk radio? Rush Limbaugh cannot be the Daniel person in our situation. Who will be the Daniel people? May I suggest God is counting on folks like you and me to be the Daniel people for this moment? One thing is clear. Despite how much people may want to pretend that things are going to get back to normal, when you've seen handwriting on a wall, nothing is really the same anymore. That not only messes up your party, that's a thought that doesn't go away. Things are never the same after that. People who've seen a disembodied hand write on a wall can't forget what they've seen. Even if they aren't sure what it means, they can't forget it. And no one will forget the handwriting that came on our wall in 2020. We will tell our children's children, and they will tell their children's children about this handwriting, just as we are reading about this handwriting on the wall in Daniel 5. One issue for us is whether we will be the Daniel people and decipher the meaning of the handwriting on our wall. But that raises another question. Do we want to be the prophetic people like Daniel in the first place? Do we want to be the Daniel people? Remember, Daniel wasn't on the royal guest list for this banquet. He wasn't partaking in the revelry when the hand appeared. He hadn't been invited to be part of the party. He wasn't the first advisor the king consulted to decipher the handwriting on the wall. Daniel was summoned last to the banquet, and then only after the king's closest and favorite advisors, his favorite wizards, his favorite preachers had been consulted and weren't able to decipher the handwriting. Daniel was invited precisely because he was not an insider to the empire. He was not on the guest list. Do we want to be on the guest list for our empire? If we do, probably we're not wanting to be like Daniel. Prophetic people are not empire people. Empire people are profiteering people. Prophetic people are not cheers and cheerleaders and friends and comforters of empire. And in this banquet-stopping moment, God doesn't need people who want to be imperial pets and imperial backslappers. God doesn't need people who are for sale or hire by the forces of capitalism and racism and militarism. God doesn't need people who can be bought off or bribed off or bossed off. God doesn't need folks who will go along and get along. God needs people who refuse to be bought, refuse to be bribed, refuse to be bullied. Remember, Daniel was offered a reward. He said, you can take your reward and keep it. God needs people who will speak the truth even when doing so isn't popular, isn't profitable, and isn't even practical. And the question for you and me is, can God find people like Daniel when God looks at us? Is that who we want to be? Let's pray. Oh God, help us to know and speak your truth during this time of pandemic, anxiety, and imperial overreach. Help us, O God, to remain steadfast and unmovable and loyal to your call on our lives to be people of justice, grace, truth, and shalom peace, even in the face of an empire that wants to get back to its banquet-dueling ways, gets back to its racist ways, its capitalism at all cost ways, its brag and boast and posturing ways. Help us to be people like Daniel. Strengthen us to speak and live your truth now and always, in obedience to the greatest of your prophets, not Daniel, but Jesus Christ. Amen.